Good good afternoon, everybody. The Committee on Education, Libraries, and Public Broadcasting will now call this public hearing back to order. We had recessed earlier because of the oversight hearing going into 2 p.m., and so we allowed the GDOE panel that was here earlier some time to go to lunch, but we'll go ahead and start. Before we begin, though, there's some housekeeping matters that we'll briefly discuss so that we can get right into work. The first notice of this public hearing was disseminated to all senators and media outlets on June 16, 2026, with its second notice disseminated on June 22, 2026. Notices of this hearing were also made available on Candid News Group, the Guam Legislature's website, our legislative calendar, and the Government of Guam's public notice portal. Today's public hearing is being broadcast live on the Guam Legislature's YouTube channel, and the transcript will be filed with the Committee on Rules and be made available on the Guam Legislature's website. Today we will hear testimony on Bill number 286-38, COR, introduced by myself, Senator Vincent A.V. Borja, an act to amend Chapter 3 of Division 2, Title 17, Guam Code Annotated, relative to the composition of the Guam Education Board. At this time, I'll recognize my colleagues who's joining me this afternoon. Senator Sean Gumatao, thank you for being here. And before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone in attendance of Ileza Tudangohan's general rules of conduct. Individuals testifying shall first be recognized by the chairperson before speaking and shall state their full name for the record. Questions and testimony shall be confined to the substance or nature of today's agenda. Personal inferences to the character or motive of any senator or individual testifying is not permitted. Pursuant to Section 11.07 of the 38th Guam Legislature Standing Rules, a chairperson may order the removal from a hearing of a committee or subcommittee of any person who is not a member of Ileza Tudangohan and who fails to observe proper decorum. Any violation to this general rule of conduct will result in immediate removal from this public hearing room. With that said, we'll now proceed to hear testimony on Bill number 286-38, introduced by myself. Again, an act to amend Chapter 3, Division 2, Title 17, Guam Code Annotated, relative to the composition of the Guam Education Board. Before I do my opening, for those that are here to testify, they'd like to come to the table. We have Ms. Doris Bukikosa, Jordan Bukikosa, Dr. Ron McNinch, Mr. Kenneth Chargaloff, and Dr. Judith Gutherts. And I'll do my opening. Buenas and Hapade. I want to thank everybody here today and those watching for this public hearing on Bill 286-38. Thank you to my colleagues, the GDOE leadership, members of the Guam Education Board, educators, parents, students, and members of the community who are here to provide testimony. Bill 286 did not come from one meeting, one complaint, or one political moment. This bill came from the community. Over the past year, through town halls, oversight hearings, roundtables, school visits, community meetings across Guam, we have heard the same concerns again and again. Parents are frustrated by the lack of answers, teachers feel unheard, unsupported, and in some cases, afraid to speak openly. School administrators are trying to keep campuses running while dealing with policies that do not always match the reality on the ground. And students are asking for what every child deserves: a safe classroom, a qualified teacher, working facilities, and a school system that puts them first. What we heard was not one isolated concern. It was a pattern. People are asking for accountability, they're asking for better communication, they're asking for who is responsible when things go wrong, and they're asking whether the Guam Education Board, as currently structured, is working the way it should. This is what Bill 286 is about. For the last few years, we've seen the administration say it has no power over education. At the same time, we've had a board that, for the most part, allowed management to figure it out on its own. That structure has left too much room for confusion, finger pointing, and delay. Bill 286, we're hoping, changes that. The bill moves away from the current hybrid model and creates an appointed Guam Education Board. And under this proposal, the governor has a role, the legislature has a role, and students have a role. Public education is too important to be governed without clear responsibility. When schools are struggling, when facilities are failing, when audits are delayed, when teachers and parents are not being heard, and when students are affected, the people of Guam deserve to know who is responsible. An appointed structure creates a clearer line of accountability. If a board member is appointed, then the appointing authority is responsible for that appointment. If that member is not following the law, not doing the work, or not serving students, there's a clearer process to address that. This is not about taking the people out of the process. It's about making sure the people know who is responsible. Bill 286 also gives the board the structure needed to bring whole of government approach to education. GDOE cannot solve every problem alone. Facilities, procurement, finance, public safety, public health, workforce development, and student services all require coordination across government. This bill holds political leaders accountable for education, not just in words, but in structure. Students are not just affected by the school system, they're a part of it. We should not only ask adults to speak about what students experience, we should give students a voice to someone who has recently lived it. Bill 286 includes a student member who recently graduated from a Guam public high school, and that matters. The voice that belongs this is a voice that needs to be at the table. Recently, I completed a practicum class focused on education, governance, and board reform. Through that work, I studied different models across the United States, including how appointments, accountability, public participation, and student voice can be structured. That work and that research reinforced what had already been heard from the community. If we want real reform, we have to look at the structure. We cannot keep asking the same system to produce different results without examining who makes decisions, how those decisions are made, and who is responsible for when outcomes do not improve. We also have to address the management and curriculum audit required under Public Law 37-44. The law required GDOE to initiate its first management and curriculum audit since 2009. This was supposed to be a serious review of governance, finance, human resources, facilities, technology, school safety, operations, and instruction. The FY 2024 audit released by the Office of Public Accountability identified low trust and fractured relationships between the Guam Education Board, GDOE leadership, and GDOE staff. That should concern all of us. A school system cannot work when the people governing it do not have trust for the people running it. It cannot improve when the relationship between the board, the superintendent, leadership, and staff is broken. And it cannot deliver better outcomes for students when governance itself becomes part of the problem. The audit called for stronger professional development, measurable performance metrics, and clearer boundaries between the board and the superintendent. Those are important recommendations. But the larger issue is this: the audit was completed, its findings were discussed, and the legislature and the people of Guam still have not received what the law required. Public Law 37-44 was not passed so another report could sit on a shelf. It was not passed so findings could be discussed behind closed doors, selectively referenced in public. It was passed because this community needed transparency. It was passed because our education system needed an honest assessment. And it was passed because accountability means more than completing an audit. It means releasing it, acting on it, and implementing corrective action. On May 27, 2026, I wrote to the chairwoman to formally express concern and seek immediate clarification regarding the board's failure to comply with Public Law 37-44. At the February 4, 2026 oversight hearing, the board indicated there were issues we wanted to clarify before the draft audit could be released publicly. Clarification may be appropriate in some cases, but clarification cannot become an excuse for a delay. As of June 24, 2026, 141 days has passed since that oversight hearing. 141 days since the audit was publicly acknowledged. 141 days since findings and concerns from the audit were openly discussed. And 141 days and the legislature has still not received the report by law. Bill 286 is part of a response to a governance structure that has not acted with the urgency, transparency, or accountability this moment requires. The Office of Public Accountability has raised serious and repeated concerns within GDOE. We have seen high-risk status, repeat audit findings, internal control weaknesses, and missed opportunities to use federal resources for critical services. We have also heard directly from the community about retaliation, poor communication, compliance issues, unclear responsibility, and lack of trust. These are not separate issues. When an audit identifies low trust, fractured relationships, unclear boundaries, and weak accountability, and when that same audit still has not been properly transmitted and made available to the people, this legislature has a responsibility to examine the structure of the board itself. This is why Bill 286 moves away from the hybrid model and creates an appointed Guam Education Board. It gives the government a role, the legislature a role, and it gives the Guam recent public high school graduate a seat at the table. Public education requires leadership. It also requires oversight. This bill is not about attacking anybody. It's about strengthening institutions, making sure no board, agency, or office is above accountability, and it's about creating a governance structure that is transparent, responsive, lawful, and centered on students. The people of Guam have spoken through town halls, hearing school visits, conversations, and testimony. They have asked for accountability. They have asked for clarity, and they have asked for a structure that works. The management audit has given us a warning. The board's delay has given us another. The community has given us its testimony. Now the question is whether or not we're willing to act. This is an opportunity to move from frustration to reform, an opportunity to rebuild trust, and an opportunity to create a board structure that is more accountable, more responsive, and more connected to the people it serves. We look forward to hearing from everybody today and to receiving the continued input from our community. Sijuas Ma'asi, and thank you for being here today. And for testimonies, for those here to testify today, we'll go ahead and start with Ms. Doris Bukikosa.
Good afternoon, Senator Borja, Chairman of the Committee on Education. My name is Doris Bukikosa. I'm going to ask if I can go ahead and let Mr. Chargaloff go first. That's okay?
Absolutely. But before we go, let me recognize my colleague who just joined us, Senator Chris Burnett. Thank you for being here. Mr. Chargaloff, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Honorable Vince Borja, Chairman of Committee on Education, and Senator Sean Gamatauto and Senator Chris Burnett. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come before you and discuss some of my own perspective regarding Bill 286-38. I respectfully submit this testimony in support of Bill 286-38 relative to the composition of the Guam Education Board. My name is Kenneth P. Chargaloff, originally from Inalahan and currently residing in Windward Hills, Jonia. Based on my years of experience in public education, I believe the governance structure proposed in Bill 286-38 presents an opportunity to strengthen the Guam Education Board and enhance its ability to serve the students and families of Guam. Effective governance and broad community engagement are essential to advancing the department's vision, improving student outcomes, and promoting efficiency and accountability throughout the Guam public school system. Although I left the fold from the Guam Department of Education 14 years ago, the department remains close to my heart. Having had the privilege of serving as a teacher, school principal, associate superintendent of schools, and member of the Guam Education Board, I feel compelled to share my perspective and respectfully encourage thoughtful consideration of Bill 286-38 with several recommendations regarding the proposed language. With respect to subsection 3102.3a, the bill authorizes the governor of Guam to appoint 4 voting members subject to the advice and consent of the legislature, with the appointment staggered over 2 terms. The bill further provides the Speaker to appoint 2 voting members to serve 2-year terms without requiring legislative advice and consent, and without identifying specific position categories. In addition, the Guam Education Board will select 1 youth member to serve a 1-year term. I respectfully recommend that this portion of the legislation be revisited to ensure consistency in the application of the advice and consent process for appointments made by both the governor and the speaker. Establishing a uniform appointment process will help promote transparency, accountability, and consistency in the board membership. Although the proposed bill authorizes the Guam Education Board to appoint a youth representative between the ages of 18 and 25 who has graduated from the Guam Department of Education public high school, this requirement may be viewed as narrowly defining youth representation and could raise concerns about inclusivity or perceived discrimination. It is also important to recognize that there is already an island-wide board of governing students serving as ex officio members, representing students currently within the Guam Department of Education system. In light of these considerations, I recommend that a mayor representative from the Mayor's Council of Guam be included as a voting member of the board. Each mayor represents their respective village and serve as a direct voice for the constituents across the island. Their participation will ensure broader island-wide representation that reflects the full spectrum of the community perspectives, rather than limiting representation to narrowly defined subgroups. I'm sorry. This approach will strengthen inclusivity by embracing island-wide governance, ensuring that the board reflects the diversity of Guam's communities as a whole. Additionally, on page 9, subsection 3103, line 19, the position of associate superintendent has been statutorily replaced with the title deputy superintendent. Consideration may be given to clarifying the rational implications of this change to ensure alignment with the Guam Department's organizational structure and responsibilities. Sijus Masi, for your continued commitment to public education, for considering this opportunity to strengthen the future of Guam schools. I respectfully support Bill 286-38 with minor revisions noted above, and appreciate the opportunity to provide this testimony for consideration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chargaloff. Ms. Doris, if you'd like to go.
Thank you, Senator Borja, Senator Gumatautau, and Senator Barnett. Thank you for the opportunity to come before the committee to also be in favor or show my support for Bill 286-38, with some concerns, of course. Initially, when I read the proposal, my first concern was appointments. Of course, the concern is this just going to create a committee of loyalists to Adelup or loyalists to the legislature? However, in reading the position descriptions, I am very grateful because I too have suggested in a town hall meeting that we really should look at the composition and where these individuals are coming from, their expertise or their knowledge in order to serve on the board appropriately. So I do thank the committee and commend them for taking that into consideration. There is one area that that kind of stood out for me, the third position, which is one member who is a retired teacher or administrator of the Guam Department of Education. I totally agree with that. However, having served for the Department of Education, working with the department for over 34 years, as a support staff in middle management level, I'd like to see that possibility. And the only reason why I'm asking for that consideration is, yes, a teacher definitely gives perspectives on challenges and how supports can be given directly to the students in that classroom instruction. Yes, a school administrator oversees the operations, but a middle management support staff is very knowledgeable on the processes that are going on within the department, everything from hiring to payroll to procurement to fixed assets, and those kind of challenges, a board member or some decisions going on at the board level don't necessarily have that expertise or knowledge or understanding of the processes. I think that could be considered. Of course, it's just my wish on that, but if that could be considered as another option as far as either teacher or administrator, it would be very appreciated. I know that there is a position there for non-voting member for the union, and I was kind of explained to me at some point that that's where the representation of a support staff would come from. But I have to point out, having worked for the department for 34 plus years, I was not a member of the union of GFT. So who is truly represented there? Is it just their members that are being represented? I'd like to see, others that may have some insight on how the department works also represented on the board. Another concern I had, that's all in the positions, just really then the fact that those who are appointed by the governor and the legislature, it talks about they can be removed at the pleasure of either, whoever was the appointing party. My concern is this, again, years and years of having some board members who have gone above and beyond their duties and may have acted inappropriately to employees at the department, support staff, all the way up to management. There really was no structure in place to remove these individuals. In this situation here and the proposal, who would those concerns be taken to? Would it be taken directly to the governor if there were continued issues with inappropriate behavior of board members? Is it taken to the speaker for their two appointees? Again, there's no real structure of how to remove, and I don't want to be a negative Nancy. I want to have some reassurance that should this structure go into place, if there is still the possibility or the instance of inappropriate behaviors occurring, how can the employees, the parents, the community make some kind of recommendation to have that person removed? So some kind of language in there. And I think that is really the only thing I have concerned about it. Otherwise, I am totally in support. I truly appreciate the committee's efforts in listening to town hall meetings and the concerns. I did read parts of that report and felt that it really did capture what I was experiencing throughout all my years at the Department of Education. So I am really grateful, and again, I am in total support of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bukakosa. Jordan?
Senators, I also would like to sort of turn towards the other people here on the panel, just because of course in a sense they're more of ranking members. So I'd prefer if our ranking members over here on this side please go first.
Please go ahead.
Okay, they forced me to do it. Okay, Hafaday senators, Senator Borja, chairman, Senator Barnett, former chairman, Senator Gumatautal. Thank you for the opportunity to, that you're holding this public hearing regarding this bill. It is unfortunate that, really there isn't a little bit more of an attendance here, but of course, maybe some, employees, current employees may not necessarily be willing to come out. We don't know. That, that could always be part of it, but, just for, full disclosure, I am a current employee of the Department of Education. I am here on my own time. These opinions are 100% my own. They don't reflect anything in terms of GDOE management, GDOE as a organization, or of the board or anything like that. I speak only for myself as an individual citizen. With regard to the proposal, of course, on the sign-up sheet, they have the option to say support or oppose. I feel like in its current form, I don't know necessarily whether I'm fully on one side or the other. I think that there are, of course, some technical questions from my side that I'm thinking of, but also, as has been mentioned by the previous two speakers, I think that there is room for adjustments. There's room for strengthening of certain provisions and complete additions of other provisions. I'll try to not go off on too many tangents. So, just starting from the top, I think the first question I have in terms of this proposal as it's written is the same thing that came up in terms of who are the appointees. I strongly advocate, same thing, not just because we share the same last name, but because I truly feel that, with the current breakup of the members, I don't know necessarily that, a retired teacher or principal necessarily has the same viewpoint or, is advocating for the same things as, for example, a more recently retired, central office staff or something like that, right? And, this is not to sort of pit the two against each other, oh, is it the schools versus central office? It's, I think that both sides need representation in terms of, what is the work that they're doing and who is advocating for them. It's the same sort of question that comes from what was brought up in terms of the GFT. There's a question of, yes, the GFT represents employees, but the question comes, what is the priority of GFT? If the priority of GFT is the implementation of the collective bargaining agreement, then that has next to nothing to do with GDOE central office employees. So really, if it came push to shove in terms of budget of a prioritization, of course, similar to how previous superintendent and the current superintendent are sort of breaking up the monies, the prioritization is always going to be, we'll try to prioritize the school staff, but to what extent is that to the detriment of the central office divisions and our ability to sort of continue to do our work? So that's one area where I think having that consideration for whether it be an additional one member or maybe switching out one category for another category, that be taken into account. For the youth representative, because it was just brought up, for me, I think I generally understand the thought process behind why we want to have youth representation, because of course it's 18 to 25, so they've been recently in the department. They should have some recent recollections of the sort of issues they had. This process was slow. How do we sort of implement policies to improve that process? So for me, I think that there is value in having an 18 to 25 who is specifically recently graduated from GDOE. So I not to disagree with the former chair of the board, but I think that I think there's good cause to leave it in there. Second question, moving on, it's the same thing as sort of in terms of the appointing authorities. So for me personally, I don't have a horse in the race in terms of the, for example, prior board members from other commissions who were, ostentatiously removed from their commission memberships, right? We've had it, whether it's CLTC or other areas, right? So for me, when I see at the pleasure of, whether it be the governor or the speaker, I think that there's a little bit of concern, because we don't necessarily want it to be all about politics or like what happens if the appointed member disagrees or votes a certain way that the governor or the speaker don't like, and then now we're going to say, oh, because you've voted a different way, I'm going to remove you. So I think that perhaps if there was a way that we could, of course, we want the legislature and the governor to both be involved, but not necessarily let it be at the pleasure of them. Let them make the selection. Let the legislature do the advice and consent process. Even for the speaker, because I don't know necessarily that the person appointed by the speaker and what's the utility of making the person selected by the speaker go through the appointment process when it's the speaker who's selecting them, right? So there's questions on that, of course, but I think that there's more value in having them undergo the public hearing process, regardless of whether it's the governor or the legislature. And then for removal, rather than let it be at the pleasure of, and it's just I sign a letter and say, sorry, I don't like you anymore, I'm cutting you off, I think there would be value in making it something that's a little bit more comprehensive. So I'm thinking, would it be possible for us to sort of set up a scenario where, we do it removal by petition, for example? And I think that this is sort of the strongest, voicing of public discontent, right? Is, if we can, say you have to meet a certain number of petition signatures to then, establish like a recall vote. Of course, this is sort of novel in the sense that we don't often have recall votes on Guam, but, I think that this would be sort of the most appropriate way to sort of depoliticize and ensure that if we're actually going to have complaints coming up against whether it's an individual board member or multiple board members, let this be the sort of criteria for what determines whether they've done such a injustice or they've, gone so far astray from public opinion. So I don't think it's, necessarily has to be like something at the level of GEC where we're talking about 100 signatures and you're good to go. Let's make it, a moderate amount of signatures where, it actually requires a decent amount of work and a decent amount of people to agree that, yes, we don't agree with what this board, our appointee is doing. We agree with trying to remove them. That's it for that part. Moving down, of course, there is now a sort of a technical question. So in the breakout of the appointing time frame, right? So it says that we're going to appoint each of these people for 2-year terms, and then at the end of the bill, it says that it's going to be effective upon the end of a certain term for certain board members, current board members. So the question here becomes, there are certain members who are appointed, who are 3-year terms. So the question is how would it work in terms of lining up when that board member's term ends and the start of this new system? Because I think that there may be some overlap. So on a technical sense, there might need to be some review of that to determine if it actually lines up, to make sure that it actually is actionable. So that's the one thing I would say on that. Outside of that area, just because, I think this will be my last point, just because it kind of extends a little bit beyond. I don't know if it would be rule germane if you were to try to adjust it. But there is, and this is now my perspective as a current employee, in terms of GDOE, the department versus the board's opinions, right, is I think that there needs to be some clarity in terms of what are the roles of the board versus the superintendent. And the reason why I bring this up is because, of course, there's always this sort of fight between, there was always, not necessarily now. I think, now the GDOE management and the board are relatively friendly. They're trying to maintain good relationships, which I think can be seen as an improvement for some. Some others may, not see it necessarily as so good. But just in terms of really delineating, what is micromanaging, what is operational duties, what are, sort of these areas where we're saying the superintendent has authority. One of the major issues that comes to mind, right, is the board has a responsibility to approve and amend the GDOE budget as needed. That's coming straight from 17 GCA. There's a question then, of course, in each annual appropriation bill, the superintendent is given budgetary transfer authority. So there's a question now of, okay, so wait a minute, if the superintendent has budgetary transfer authority, then what does it mean for the board's responsibility to amend the budget? If there is no more, budget amendment necessary because the superintendent has transfer authority, does that then trump it? There's this question of what is the spend plan, and does the superintendent have sort of the flexibility to make changes as needed? And then, that's sort of something there. So I think, perhaps a more in-depth look into, what are the actual responsibilities and how do we delineate what is a board function, what is policy versus what is operational matters. And, of course, this is not necessarily to slight the board because, of course, I think, based on all of the different meetings that I've listened to since, Dr. Guthertz has come in, I feel that, I see Dr. Guthertz, has a lot of love for, our students, our children, and a lot of love for the department to really see us succeed. But, I think that it just needs to be really delineated because at this point there's a lot of overlap in terms of, what the board is, making sure the superintendent is doing a good job versus is it the board is now trying to influence what operational decisions the superintendent is making. So this then, sort of gets into the question of, okay, so if the superintendent is making decisions that don't align with board opinions or opinions of certain board members or opinion of the board as a whole, now we get into the issue of, okay, so the board selects the superintendent and has the authority to fire the superintendent. What operational flexibility is there really? Because at the end of the day, the superintendent is subject, hired and fired by the board. So I think that that's also another area where I think that it would be beneficial for us to review because it's the same thing. If we can hire a superintendent, that's perfectly fine by me. Same thing, appointing board members, perfectly fine. But I think in terms of removal of a superintendent or removal of board members, that's where I think we should maximize public input. and let the public be the one to determine, are we discontent with a superintendent? Are we discontent with a board? And, let that be the determining factor. So, all that being said, I appreciate again the opportunity to speak on the matter. I hope that, the ideas can be considered, given a fair shake. And, I think that it would, it wouldn't be bad to, even have, further public hearing, because, I think that we really need more people to sort of give their opinions on this, instead of rushing into changing it, because we want to remove it from elected and just make it appointed, right? So I think that this kind of proposal is of such magnitude that it deserves a lot more input than just those who are just showing up. I think we need to really put it out there and say, we need to hear what people want. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bukakosa. Dr. Guthertz?
And I'd also like to commend those who are former educators and leaders at the Department of Education for being here, and also our current employee. He's a wonderful person. He does a great job in our financial area at GDOE, and thank you for being willing to give your thoughts, Dr. McNinch. It's interesting, Senators, that we are here to talk about a proposed model change for the Board of Education. And I have a lot of experience with previous boards of education. I was a first appointed member of the Department of Education's Board of Education during the governorship of Paul Calvo. I had just come back from graduate school, and Governor Calvo asked me to please sit on the board, and he appointed me, and I was confirmed by the legislature. And then later on, the legislature passed a different board law establishing an elected school board for the Department of Education. And I ran and I won a position on that board. And that was during the Superintendent Gloria Nelson's time. And maybe halfway through our term, then Governor Ada decided that the Organic Act did not allow for an elected school board, because the law at that time, the Organic Act, congressional law, said that the governor of Guam was responsible for public education, public safety, and public health. So he challenged the organicness of the elected school board, and he won his case. And we were subsequently dismissed as members of the school board. I'll never forget it. Former Lieutenant Governor Frank Bloss came to one of our school board meetings, and he brought the police officers with him to remove us from the Department of Education building. It was quite a scene. It was extremely interesting at that time. So then the senators were quite upset with that happening, and so they petitioned Congress to amend the Organic Act to allow the people of Guam to decide how they wanted to administer and lead, in terms of boardsmanship, the Department of Education. And Congress responded, and they amended the Organic Act to say that the people of Guam will decide how to administer their public school system, and the legislature representing the people of Guam passed the elected school board law that's currently in place. Again, I participated in that election, and I won and served on the board at that time. And then we are here today again. And I give that background to you to let you know that we've tried different models on the island. And I'm very happy, Senator, that you participated in some activity to learn more about different education models, right? No model is perfect. And my personal perspective is, I'd like to see improvements, and if it means that we forego the elected board because the school system would work better with an appointed board, I don't object to that at all. I do not object to that. I want what's best for the children of Guam and Guam's future. In the current board system, and I've been on the board about a year and a half, there are some deficiencies, and there are times, Mrs. Pupukosa is correct, that create a little confusion as to who does what. However, my interpretation of what we do as a board is we have our monthly meetings. We handle the agenda together with the superintendent. We set the agenda. We vote on those matters that require board consideration. And I have to say the board is very careful in how they vote. They're very independent members there, and they try to choose the best course of action for the school system. The board has board committees. The board committees meet, and they take up various agenda items for the board committees that relate to departmental activities. And we have a curriculum committee. We have the school calendar committee. We have the policy committee. We have the finance committee. So various committees of the board. And the board members give their input and their suggestions. But we don't vote on anything because we don't vote in committee. We vote only during board meetings on different things. But we try to give guidance to the school system as best we can. Now, you brought up the issue in your comments. I listened carefully to your comments, Senator Borja. And, you know, it's, for me, sitting here and hearing that, of course, it's very sad for me because most of your comments were very negative, to be frank with you. And you may have a basis and you feel strongly about certain things, and I respect that. But I do want to say that there's more good than bad at DOE and on the school board. No one on the school board would intentionally try to hurt our school system, our students, our educational goals, right? We are very different from each other. I try not to interfere in things I know I should not be involved with. I don't overstep my duties as a board member or as chair. I always work through the superintendent. If there's a problem or issue that comes up and it's brought to my attention, I share it with the superintendent and I ask her to look into the issue because it's an operational, usually it's an operational kind of issue. If it's an informal complaint, if someone says something to me at a function and I want the superintendent to know there's a concern about this, I will let her know and I ask her to please look into it. I don't tell her what to do or how to handle it. I just provide the information. I don't micromanage. I have not seen, personally, board members micromanage. I don't spend a lot of time at the schools, primarily because I do not want to be accused of interfering with school operations. I will go to schools when it's an honorific kind of situation, a graduation, an event. When I'm invited for a school function, I will visit the school, but I will never go to a school to direct them as to what they should do and shouldn't do. And I'm hoping that the other school board members act the same way. I cannot speak for them, but I do want to clarify that. Now, in reading the bill, as was suggested, you know, I think there's probably some changes in order, right? I am concerned about senators appointing members to the school board. In terms of models, you have to go one way or the other. Either you have a fully elected board or a fully appointed board. And in terms of public administration, and you understand public administration, it's not common for legislative bodies to appoint people to boards and commissions. And I know we've seen a few where that's happened. GVB is one area that we see that in. And there may be a couple others. But my recommendation would be that the appointing authority should be the chief executive. In addition, I'd like to recommend that you consider looking at the current board model that we have for the Public Utility Commission and for the CCU. The CCU is an elected board, of course, but they are empowered to do what they do at GPA and GWA. The PCU is an appointed board, and the members have 6-year terms, which gives them that autonomy in terms of what Mrs. Buscosa was saying, that we don't want to see an appointed board become a political platform. We want to see an appointed board act with independence. And you might see a better outcome if you give the board a longer tenure after they're appointed, because I don't think anyone on the PUC is beholden to any political interest in reviewing the recommendations of the Consolidated Commission on Utilities and making decisions on rates and infrastructure investments by our utilities, by our airport, by the Port Authority, whoever falls under their jurisdiction. I would also suggest, with great sincerity, that we don't be too specific as to where the board members should come from in terms of identification with groups or representation of specified stakeholders. I'd like to give the appointing authority more freedom to make those decisions. And the reason I say that is because there's different periods in time where you may want to not have such structured appointments. You know, if we're going through serious financial difficulty in the government, we might want to have some board members that have more financial experience, more experience in dealing with funds, rather than someone from the union or someone from this group or someone from that group. So you give the appointing authority, you know, more freedom to determine what is needed at this point in time in our school system so that it operates well, operates smoothly, and has the right policymakers on the board to help direct the direction of the school system, right? So that would be one of my recommendations. And I also would suggest, and I think, again, you brought up the point that where do people go if they have a concern about the board members? The idea of having a petition to recall board members. We can do that right now. We don't need a law to allow that, by the way. If someone wanted to start a petition and say, we feel this board member has not been judicious in his or her responsibilities, and we, the people of Guam, represented by these 500 signatures or 1,000 signatures, are petitioning that they be removed. And then you need to have a mechanism. Who's going to hear that petition? See, there's no mechanism for that. So you'd have to develop that as part of this recall movement, right? But I would suggest that, just like right now under the law, all of us are subject to review. If we do something wrong or improper, we could be brought before the Ethics Commission, right? That includes all board members and appointed officials, elected officials, classified, unclassified. It doesn't matter. That's one review group if it's a question of ethics and integrity. And then we could also request perhaps a review by the Attorney General's office if there's a board member that may have overstepped the law and how they're conducting themselves. We can ask for an independent review from that office to guide some action. But there needs to be, I would say, an external review system rather than internal review system. If there's questions about board members performing their jobs or overstepping their bounds or doing something improper. We do have some existing entities. We also have the Civil Service Commission that you can designate them as an additional duty to review complaints against board members throughout the government of Guam for overstepping their grounds. I'm sure the legislature wouldn't want to do the reviews. So you take an existing entity that has the ability to do it, to have an unbiased hearing, and then to evaluate, and then to give their recommendation to the appointing authority. It should be the appointing authority that would remove a board member who's not performing their duties according to the law. As I said, I think others may disagree with me. I'm sure Dr. Minich may have a different perspective. But I will respect whatever law you pass. But I do ask you to please look at the necessity to ensure that as much as possible the political element doesn't find its way into decision-making on the Board of Education. The appointment, maybe that'll happen naturally, you know. But after someone's appointed, their sole responsibility must be to the people of Guam and the children of Guam. So give them that independence, even as an appointed board. Give them a longer term so that they go beyond the tenure of a legislature or the tenure of a governor. Reevaluate whether senators the legislature should appoint people to the board. I would say that also don't be too specific on which sectors of society should be appointed to the board. You know, one of the problems that governors have had in the past, and those of you that work with governors know, it's hard to get people from certain sectors to want to serve on a board. And so they don't have a person from this group there because it's hard to find someone willing to do it. It's not that easy to find people willing to serve on appointed boards and commissions. Another thing you need to take care of is the complexity of people. If you're going to continue with an elected board or a hybrid board like that, I have to tell you, it's a lot of trouble to become a candidate for the school board, and that's why you don't have a lot of people filing. Believe it or not, getting the 250 signatures is not as easy as it looks. And the question is why? Why? You know? And then the other issue is the financial disclosure part. It's very cumbersome, and you know that because you do the same one that we have to do. And if you want to know about someone's life, you know, who they owe money to, how much money do they make, what do they own, it's all there. It's all there for the world. And then I'm wondering, is that too much information? Is there a security issue there too? If people know what you own, could you be a target? Because all your personal financial information is there? You know, so I hope you would reconsider some of those requirements at present also, if you decide to keep an elected board. So in general, you need to do what you feel you need to do. I can tell you that the board I'm working with is a hard-working group. We're doing our very best. The current law is not ideal. There's deficiencies. One is in defining who does what. The other is sometimes there's limitations on what we can do that make it harder for us to introduce the kind of reforms that are needed in the school system. We can only go so far, because if we go farther, we're micromanaging. That's how it's interpreted by some of you, by some employees at the school system. And that's not a good thing. So we need to refine these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Guthertz. Dr. McNinch. Dr. Wampat, will you be testifying as well, if you'd like to come to the...
Oh, is Dr. Wampat here? Please.
Please?
Yeah.
Actually,
I can move over, yeah. Okay, all right.
Seniority, okay. Thanks, Dr. Wampat.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Borja, Senator Gumatauto, and Senator Barnett. I'm back. So, buenas, Chairman. I'm submitting, well, I have to do some typing over again, but I'm going to provide written public testimony on Bill 286-38. And there are some notable characteristics and differences, of course, I'd like to go ahead and share with the members here and the listening audience, is to clarify Bill number 286-38 COR eliminates the public's participation in determining the board's composition. Existing law allows the public to elect 6 of the 9 voting members. The elected members serve 2-year terms. The governor, with the advice and consent of the legislature, appoints 3 members who must be one of each of the following: 1, employed in an upper management managerial position in a private business; 2, a parent of a student enrolled within DOE; and 3, a retired teacher or administrator of DOE. These appointed members serve a term for 3 years. The purpose of this, at the time when former Speaker Mark Forbes and I actually wrote this legislation on the composition of the board, trying to find many different possible options and making sure that when individuals are elected, they're not necessarily be able to fill any of these 3 in which then they are to be appointed. So what Bill then 286-38 will reduce the number of voting board members from 9 to 7. All 7 voting members are appointed by the governor, 4 of them, and the legislature 2, and the Guam Education Board 1. The governor's appointees of 4 must be one of each of the following: the same 3 criteria that is set forth in existing law, which is good, plus a single new criterion, which is a member of the general public. The legislature retains its right to advise and consent to the governor's 4 appointees. The governor's appointees' term of service are reduced from the existing law, which is 3 years, to 2 years. On the legislature's appointees, 2 appointees are not limited to any categories like the governor's are, but they must qualify to be, yes, a U.S. citizen, a resident of Guam for at least 5 years immediately preceding the term of appointment and during the term of service, not to be a felon, not to have been convicted of a misdemeanor involving criminal sexual conduct or a crime of moral turpitude. And then they must possess a high school diploma or equivalent and be at least 18 years of age at the time of the appointment. So neither the governor nor the board have any right of advice and consent regarding the legislature's 2 appointees. The legislature's appointees serve at the pleasure of the Speaker of the legislature and may be removed with or without cause for terms of 2 years. In addition to voting members, the legislature provides one of the 4 ex officio non-voting members of the board. The bill also provides that the legislature itself would have a non-voting member of the board in the person of the chairperson of the Committee on Education or his designee. This is not provided for in the existing law. The other 3 ex officio non-voting members would be the president of the Mayor's Council or his designee, the president of the Guam's Federation of Teachers or his designee, and the chairperson of IBOX of his or her designee. All these entities are represented by ex officio members in existing law, but the proposed law allows only for those officers from those entities or their designees to be members of the board. The 1 voting member that's appointed by the board must be a youth representative, GDOE high school graduate between the age of 18 to 25. The GB voting member serves 1-year term. So neither the governor nor the legislature have any right of advice and consent regarding the board's 1 appointee. The bill does not change the quorum or voting requirements, reducing the number of members necessary in order for a quorum to exist and for the board to act from 5 to 4. For qualifications, as mentioned earlier, the bill would lower the age to qualify for membership on the board from 25 years of age to 18. There are some ethical and legal issues with Bill 286-38. By virtue of the Organic Act, the supervision of all departments of the government of Guam, including the Guam Department of Education, rests with the Governor of Guam. DOE is not an autonomous agency. Bill 286-38 illegally infringes upon the functions of the executive branch. Bill 286-38 does not limit itself to changes which would improve the execution of existing Guam Education Board. Instead, it proposes a completely new and untested paradigm shift by not only eliminating all board members but by enabling the legislature itself to appoint voting board members, and by authorizing the legislature itself to have a permanent direct seat on the board, making it law for the chairperson himself or a member of the board. The ethical implication is granting such power to itself through this legislation are clear. However, more concerning is the fact that Bill 286-38 comprises an illegal delegation of power to the legislature to supervise the schools. The governance of the Department of Education is vested in the Guam Education Board pursuant to 17 GCA, Section 3102. The board's duties include adoption of annual budgets, reviewing of periodic financial reports, modifications of the budget if and when necessary. 17 GCA Section 3102.1c, such inherent conflicts of interest and the negative consequences that would follow should this legally impermissible scenario be played out, made it clear why the Organic Act prevents the legislature as a separate and independent branch of government from exercising direct control over the Guam Education Board and GDOE. By setting up the board as a staging ground for two separate branches of government to wield power, Bill 286-38 opens the door to immense possibilities of each policy issue being dominated by political conflicts and severely hampering the board's and GDOE's ability to function. GDOE, the Guam Education Board, and our schools, employees, and students cannot afford to suffer the delays and dysfunction that are inherent in this bill. The novel, untested structural overhaul being proposed in this bill is simply not legal or productive to GDOE's operations. And to close, I respectfully propose to this bill and ask that it be withdrawn, or that you put together a group to thoroughly look, at the bill. And like the senator said, and I know Mr. Charcliffe also, the three of us have been in DOE for many years, or in education, and we've seen many boards come and go. And it was a problem that the legislature in the past have always looked at, and many different options have been, of course, tried. You're never going to find one board that's going to satisfy everyone all the time, whether you want an elected board, appointed board, a hybrid board. And to elect even the superintendent, then it becomes political. So if you want politics out, I suggest you stay away from trying to even have the superintendent elected, because that will be a popularity contest than anything else, not qualification. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Wampat. Dr. McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senators. My name is Ron McNinch. I'm an elected member of the Guam School Board. I served for 6 years as an appointed member under two different governors of two different political parties, and then I've been elected twice now for the last 4 years or so. I appreciate the opportunity to give testimony today. I just wanted to make a couple of preface comments and say it's very hard to follow these two Judys. I mean, they both have so many good and neat things to say. Also, I wanted to point out, I noticed this discussion really isn't about education as much as it is about our children. And I think that our children is in all of our best interests. And I think if we have an agreement on anything, I think that's a major point of agreement, that these discussions are how can we better serve our children, how can we better serve our youth. And I just want to point out, I noticed when I came in here, there were some high school interns, Senator Borja, and they told me they're in your office. I hope all senators have interns. I think it's so wonderful to get young people out into real environments, and it's a part of their learning process. And I think that the more we can do that and be mindful of that across all professions, the better. I just want to make a quick preface comment on that. Under 17 GCA 3102.1p, one of the duties of the Board of Education is to make recommendations on policies and bills. And my points today are related to that. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. Our board hasn't articulated a position on this yet, and I believe that our chair certainly will come up with a board position that's unified. And so my views today aren't necessarily reflective of anyone on the board other than myself. This particular bill, like many bills, it seeks to change things, and whenever you try to change things, conflict is created, resistance is created. That's a natural part of the change and legislative process. It's to be expected. And there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, resistance or having a conflict can be good sometimes because it can spark action, and that's certainly a part of the public policy process. In the section 1 of the bill, there's a discussion of data or voices or information being consistently mentioned about the board. And if possible, if I could get copies of that data or those discussion points, it would help me. It would help better inform my letter, which I'll write right after this particular point. As I mentioned, I was both appointed and elected. In my experience, being an elected member has more respect from the community. People connect with you a lot more when you're elected. I do believe in at least talking about electing the superintendent, but for very long terms, like 8 to 10 years, which would create stability. But again, that's just an idea. Now, I need to mention, this is a very unique moment in time. If we go back to the Guam Constitutional Convention, there was a whole section on education. I encourage everyone in these conversations to look at that. They proposed an education commission. And by the way, both Dr. Guthers and Dr. Wampat served on that commission. It's very rare to meet people, especially 2 people at one time, who served on that Constitutional Convention Commission. I think it's a very unique opportunity. But I think that having an education commission aspect is something to certainly discuss. But there's something that in the earlier meeting today that Senator Barnett brought up, and he brought up the issues with FB Leon Guerrero School. I'm a big advocate myself of site-based schools with individual school boards, where you have the parents and teachers and other major stakeholders at the school, and then they become the advocate for that school, along with the mayors, the village mayors. They become the experts in the conditions of that school. And then the education, Department of Education is the central, administrative function, of course. But I'm talking about in terms of school elements. And so in a way, I've suggested take a look at virtually making every public school site a charter school, giving the parents and teachers the ability to have that direct voice. And I think that there's something that could be said to that. I have another couple of general suggestions about best practices, what I think would be good for the Education Board. And these are just ideas. I think, as Dr. Guthers mentioned, the PUC has 6-year terms. I think 6-year terms are great. I think if we have 6-year terms, we should stagger. I think that all 9 members should be elected with 3 elected per year. So you get, or per election cycle. So 3 board members could be elected per election cycle. That'll increase the competition and reduce, just only having 6 people run for 6 positions, so to speak. I think the 18-year-olds should be able to run for the school board. And I think it would be a great, neat opportunity to see young people get themselves elected. If you appoint young people to boards like this, they're not respected as much. And I've seen that not only on Guam kinds of boards, but also nationally. I was on the NASB board for many years, or for 5 years. I'd like to talk just a moment about the election packet. This election packet is just as complex as the packet for senators. It really is. I'd love, please go take a look at this. And I'm not knocking the Guam Election Commission, they're just following the law. But I have some suggestions about applying for the election on this. I think that there shouldn't be signatures required. Just charge them a simple fee. You want to charge a fee like $100 or $200 to keep people from becoming vanity candidates where they just put their name on the ballot. You want them to have some investment. The other point is rather than police clearances and court clearances and things like that, just require sworn declarations. It'll save candidates money. And also, most of the people who run for these positions don't have court issues or police issues. And we have had people get elected. Matt Rector and Matt Rector got elected to the legislature, lied about his criminal record. Jonathan Tovez got himself elected to the Guam School Board many years ago, lied about his criminal record. There are people who are not honest. But I think in general, for the most part, in our community, we know if people have criminal records or not, or people that will at least talk about them. So that's one little point. I think requiring police clearances and court clearances is a discouragement. It makes it easier. That's my point here. Also, on the finance declaration, I agree with Dr. Guthertz. I think that there's two elements of the finance declaration. One, does a person have conflicts of interest with the government? That should be openly stated, and you should swear a declaration to that. The other point is, I raise zero money when I run for office. I never have. And just be able to sign a declaration on that and reduce a lot of this paperwork, because this paperwork is really putting a chilling effect on people running for these offices, in my view. You'll have a lot more people run if you adjust this a bit. Again, I'm an advocate of site-based management. I'm a big fan of it. I believe in giving parents and teachers and students real power and the ability to really be able to work on things. I think that there's some truth to that. I think that in general, there's a point in this, both in this law and in the other law about the chair. I don't like limits on the chair. We've had very good chairs that had a timeout, and it would have been great if they would have stayed, because what we got in return was not up to par. I'm just being honest. We had a really good chair, and then suddenly they have to leave because of the 2-year limit, then no telling who you're going to get. So if you have a good chair and they're elected every year by the board, you want to keep them. That's my point. And by the way, I'm not knocking any individual chair, but some people can sing good karaoke and some people can sing bad karaoke. Same thing with leadership. And you want a good leader on this board. That's what you want. And Dr. Guthertz is a very good leader, by the way. And so is Dr. Wampat as superintendent. I am deeply vexed and concerned about the things I've heard, and I spoke to Dr. Guthertz about this, about employees feeling that they're being retaliated against, or there's potential retaliation. We require some public officials to go through ethics training. I think we should suggest and make available retaliation training, meaning how to mitigate and avoid retaliation for our government employees. We have a lot of protections for our government employees if they invoke them appropriately. There are ways to invoke them. And by the way, I've made numerous complaints at my government workplace here. I've always backed them up in a way that shields me from retaliation. I cite the law, I cite the whistleblower concepts, I cite whatever protective law exists, and we need our employees to know they have these protections. And then the other point is sometimes there are resources like in the union and other places that can help. And again, I know it's not a cure-all, but I'm just making that as a suggestion of trying to move forward on it. We need to help people to know that these process systems exist. Not every year, but we usually do public trust studies. I've done a lot of them over the years. The Guam judiciary has the highest level of public trust. They're usually between 50 and 60%. The executive branch usually hovers about 30%. That's equivalent approximately, both of those are equivalent approximately to the U.S. mainland and the states. The legislature is usually between 18 and 20%. Again, that's about average for how people view the legislature. But individual senators range from 60 down to 30. So it's, hate the legislature, love your senator, so to speak. During COVID, the Guam education system was nearly 60%. We had a very strong level of public support. The work that the employees did to feed our children during that time was incredible, and it was probably underappreciated. And the hard work that many people did to try to go through and make COVID work was probably not recognized the way we should have recognized it. On the audit report, I love audits. I'm an auditor. I'm a fraud examiner. I love audits. I love audit, and I applaud the legislature for getting an audit report. I think audits are good. And I mentioned this in other places. I prefer that it would have been done either through OPA and pay people locally for it. That's a pet peeve I have. But then the other thing is there's a lot of stuff in that audit that probably should be discussed in a side meeting, in an informal side meeting even, because there's a lot of elements that really deserve discussion. And I know that sometimes doing it in a public forum is a little bit difficult, but there's some important points that should be talked about. And I am concerned part of it is, as a board member, people don't tell me if they're being mistreated by another board member. It just doesn't happen. Because I don't get, like Dr. Guthers, I don't get involved in the schools. I stay away from everything. If I had heard about that, I would have done exactly what the law says. I would have referred it to the chair of education and said, there's been a complaint, or first I would have discussed it within with the board chair, but then according to the law, you refer it to the chair of education. That's what the current law says. And I'd like to encourage all members of all boards everywhere, read the laws that govern your organization. It'll really help a lot. Finally, regarding removing board members, I have asked board members to step off the board when they weren't doing their job. I've done that. I've done it more than once. I'm not bragging about it, but there are reasons that they weren't doing very well on the board. It wasn't because they didn't have a work ethic or anything else. Sometimes they had conditions that made it difficult for them to serve. As responsible board members, we need to be able to have peers tell us very frankly if they're out of bounds. At open board meetings, I have said, excuse me, Mr. Chair, I think our fellow member is out of bounds here. I think this is micromanagement. I've done this openly in the board meetings. But regarding the thing about individual interactions with individual board members, I don't hear that as much. And part of it is, and by the way, part of it is maybe because I'm almost a foreigner here in some ways. I don't have family connections like a lot of other people do, or things like that. So I don't hear about things like that. But I do listen to employees when they talk to me, and I think that that's a part of it. But I believe that removing board members, the board itself, in the current context, can remove board members if there's cause for it. There's a process for it in the statute, in the law. Senators, I'm going to write this up in a letter. I'm going to discuss it with my peers and get additional input. I greatly appreciate the views of our other board members. I don't know the gentleman at the very end, the school team. What's your name again?
Jordan Bukikosa.
I'm very impressed with that. Very good. I like finance folks. But senators, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to say a few words today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McNinch. And now we'll go into questions. We'll go ahead and start. I'll go ahead and start. I'll start with the comments in regards to your response to my opening, Dr. Guthers. And I'm going to say this from a place of I have a lot of respect as your student in the BBA program. I was your student recently under the master's program. But the place that I come from, especially when it comes to the board and the advocacy that I have, not because my wife is a school counselor or her family. This comes from a place of listening to, hundreds of, even before I ran for senator, it was no secret in regards to the issues at the Department of Education or the issues on the board. But what I think, and this is the conversation starter for what we need to address, is the issue of the issues within the Department of Education that really most think that the board is going to address or are going to address. With my experience as the education chair over the last year and a half, every single issue that has happened, whether it be finances, assaults, you name it, not once, and I'm saying this from my experiences as a chair, and I'll leave it up to the former chair is that not once has the board ever stepped in publicly and say, we take full responsibility or we will address this issue. The issue has always come before the legislature, and that's fine because our job as senators is to listen and to respond. I think, no matter how small or how big the issue is, it's our obligation to respond to our constituents. I think the big problem that I have, or that I've always had over the last year, is that it's only grown over the last year in regards to concerns in GDOE employees not feeling and that they can speak up or they can go to board members or board members addressing the issues that employees have raised within the Department of Education, whether it was to a senator that was probably brought up in a public hearing on oversight or through them bringing it up through their leadership. The one thing, and when we talk about the board and why we're having this conversation, I mean, if you think about an employee wanting to speak up to the board, I mean, at least for me as I've been the chair, I've seen employees at a board meeting get humiliated or attacked in regards to work performance or issues within the Department of Education. So why would you expect an employee, when you have that kind of culture with the Board of Education, and these are elected members that make employees feel like their opinion doesn't matter, or scare employees. I mean, again, if a board member can publicly, on the record, attack employees, why would an employee want to speak up? I mean, we had a discussion in the last oversight hearing when we talked about the audit, and at that time, and there was a leaked letter that went to KUAM, Island Board of Governing students speaking up against or about board members being demeaning or getting yelled at and not feeling like they're being supported by the board of education. And so that's, when you say that, what I had shared in the beginning was negative, that's not from me. I speak on, if not hundreds, thousands of employees at the Department of Education. And this is not to say you suck, you quit. I'm saying that this is a cry for help. And I'm sure these other senators, when they're not speaking for themselves. I'm not speaking for me, and I'm not speaking for my wife. I'm speaking for the hundreds of employees that are saying they need help. They want to be heard. They need people to it's not even about they need to be coddled. They just need people to care about what they need and what they want, or what they need to be able to feel like they're a part of the organization. And that's all this discussion is about. And again, whether whether it's full governor, legislature, student, there's obviously an opportunity to change the way things are. I think the biggest issue that we need to address, and most of you have said, is how we remove board members. Because I feel like that is the biggest problem, is that we've had board members who have, one, not done their job, or have gone beyond their legal limitations and what their responsibilities are, or what they can or can't do as board members. And so, I hope that this discussion today is something that we, as not just senators, but even as board members, and I will give you kudos with with your leadership, and maybe it's a new superintendent, that it's been a lot more respectful in the board meetings that we've seen. But I think despite whoever was the superintendent, that's what brought us to where we are today. Thank you for the good, the good working relationship that you have with Dr. Wampet, and we hope that, again, this goes, this goes down to the organization, because that's where most of us that's where a lot of the push for change has come from. It's not, I didn't run for office and then decided one day that we need to change the board structure. This came from, I mean, you know, hundreds, if not, you know, hundreds. I'm sure Senator Barnett has been here longer, have had more complaints, and we need to try something. It's not working. And so with that, my question is, with everything that has gone over to with the Department of Education, do you think that it is the board's responsibility or should bear the responsibility for the success or failures of the Department of Education based on the way the law allows you guys to exist?
There's certain things we are responsible for, and we should always take responsibility for if it's not done right.
Could you, just for the record, what are those things that you believe that the board is responsible for?
Well, we're responsible for hiring the superintendent. We're responsible for approving the budget for the department and ensuring that the funding is used appropriately according to the law.
So with that, let me ask you, since you're saying that it's your responsibility to ensure that they're using the money in accordance with the law,
Yes,
correct?
with accountability,
So with
yes.
what just happened and what we talked about earlier this morning in the oversight hearing, what responsibility does the board bear in regards to some of the things that we're saying that may lead to legal action because of spending money that should not have been spent? Was there any oversight from the board?
First of all, you know, it has to be based on mutual trust between the board and the organization itself. And there's a lot of information that's not shared with the board, that we would never know that there's been funding decisions made that are not in accordance with the laws and the rules. I mean, that's been my experience. We learn about things after the fact, not ahead. You know, we heard today, and I was a little surprised, we've been hearing about commitments made in ways that are not in accordance with the law on the expenditure of funds. We only found that out after a change in leadership in the department, because that information was not shared with us. Obviously, we know why, and that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable, and I think that's a reflection in the weakness of the law itself. You know, we don't have the power to interfere with management's prerogatives at the department, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But when there's obvious inappropriate actions with respect to how money's being spent, you know, we should be informed about that by the director or administrator of the department when they learn about it. I'm sure Dr. Wampat had no idea when she became the interim superintendent or the acting or the permanent superintendent that this had happened at DOE. We know there were problems in terms of how federal funding was being used and reported on, meeting the reporting requirements. But we didn't know that it was being used in a way that could, in fact, be improper, legally improper.
But with all these things that, you know, how, you know, during the last oversight and the budget hearings, GDOE has come in and said they're going through a phase of discovery, right? Again, my question is, what responsibility does the board bear and to ensure that as, you know, Dr. Wampat continues her term as the superintendent, that we're not going to wait until the next superintendent to come in? Because if the board, you're saying the board is responsible for passing the budget, then in ensuring that we're spending government money in accordance with the law, where then does, what went wrong with the board not catching? Again, you're saying that there has to be a relationship between the agency and the board. So what do we do moving forward then to ensure that?
Well, I'm sure that because of the current law, we deal with the superintendent. Superintendent has to be held accountable. Now, if the superintendent didn't even know that was happening, the former superintendent, how would we know? How are we to find out that money was being used, let's say, for entertainment, for meals, at the expense of federal grants? How would we know that? None of us were present at any of those functions where these meals were provided. I don't even think the superintendent was. So how do we find out?
Maybe, I'm going to add a little humor, but maybe the same way they found out who HR was hiring all the time and who was traveling, right? I mean, if you guys, the board was very good at knowing who was traveling, who HR was hiring, and that's all I'm saying, Dr. Guthers, is that.
All the time. The board members complained about travel, and we encouraged the superintendent not to approve.
So then, again,
certain travel.
so who bears the responsibility for the actions of the Department of Education?
We didn't have power over travel. That's an operational decision. Who travels is a decision.
And you guys had
of the
oversight over finances, which, again, we're here today saying that there was a lot of shenanigans, like Senator Tello likes to call it, that happened. And
I think the answer is very clear. It's very clear. As you move towards a new model, you have to carefully think about how to see that accountability occur. Because of the restrictions and the limits of the school board, there's certain things we didn't know occurred, and that's very true. How can we be responsible for things that were not disclosed? Now we are aware, and certainly our superintendent is not going to allow those things to happen under her watch. And the current law, we would hold the superintendent accountable if it does.
thank you. Dr. Wampat, I just have to ask, because, when you were the advisor to the governor, we've had this discussion, and we talked about the structure of the Department of Education. I know today your testimony, you had your points in regards to why you don't necessarily support the bill, I'm assuming, to form, but when really this even thought of me considering the structure or governance of the Department of Education, you were the first person who told me we need to give the Department of Education back to the governor. Today, that position has changed. If you could elaborate so that I understand and on the record.
No, I did not say that at the end. I just said that all departments and agencies fall under the executive branch. The legislative, you have your own purview, and so does the judiciary. And I was in the legislature at the time when that conversation actually happened very early on in my term. And when the request was made to then Congressman Robert Underwood to amend the Organic Act to take then, because there are only 2 sections in the Organic Act where it says the governor is in charge of health, the governor is in charge of education. That portion was changed. That section was amended to say that rather than governor, it turned to government. But it never took the governor out because DOE has always been under the executive branch. It may not, in this particular case now, appoint the superintendent as previous governors have done in the past. So that's basically the only thing. If there's anyone who have more say-so, will be the legislature, because you have the power of the purse. You can decide whether, if you don't like what's going on, you reduce their budget. If you like the superintendent or the director, you may want to provide more funding. It's all political. But that hasn't changed. I'll never forget, and this is my Republican friend, former Speaker Tony Mpinko. He would always remind me of the actions that we took at the time about setting up the board to have them elected. And he said the buck stops with the governor, and it truly does. And at the time we didn't see it until we saw what was happening. And to this very day, yes, the buck stops with the governor. If you may or decide to not give the Department of Education the funds that it's requesting for, and when we say it stops with the governor, because the governor has the power then with a certain percentage that you give the governor to transfer money into the Department of Education or any other department, and to also take money away. Hence, he's correct. Speaker Umpinku is correct when he said that the buck stops with the governor. And ultimately, yes, the governor is in charge of the executive branch and all departments and agencies, and we are an instrumentality of the executive branch.
So would you support a proposal to give the Department of Education back to the
I
governor?
have no objections to turning over, the Department of Education to the governor. I've never said that that I objected to it, and I spoke with you, and that was the position the governor had, and asked me, yes, to speak with you about it, because 18 schools were closed. And she could very well just say, no, the legislature should just appropriate the money and support the Department of Education, but she stepped up. And she called all her department and agency heads. She even appealed to the autonomous agencies, and they didn't have to do this, but they did, because we all felt, the entire government felt, that we are responsible for all of the children. And that's why everyone stepped up, including the legislature. So that part has not changed.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wampat. I'll go ahead and open up the panel. I'll open up the questions to my colleagues. Senator Sean Gumatata.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panel for being with us this afternoon. I just wanted to say just a couple of things before I jump on my questions, that I appreciate the reference earlier from former Senator Guthertz about the PUC and CCU, as well as Dr. McNich's reference to Chapter 17, which gets me to my question, is in Chapter 17 GCA, Section 31109. It grants the Guam Community College and the GCC Board with the powers necessary and convenient to carry out and perform the purposes and provisions that are outlined in GCC statute. 17 GCA, Section 16104.1 establishes that the University of Guam's Board of Regents shall have general supervision over the university and the control and direction of all funds of and appropriated to the university, subject to such restrictions as may be prescribed by law. Additionally, the board shall set the policies governing the duties, conditions of employment, compensation, salary of all employees of the university. Now, recognizing that there have been repeated discussions in our community questioning whether the Guam Education Board should be a governing or policy or advisory body, does the section of law, 17 GCA, Section 3102.1, which prohibits the board from interfering or micromanaging GDOE affairs, make it unnecessarily difficult for the board to ensure general supervision over GDOE, and so that members can be held accountable for the state of public education in Guam? Does anybody want to comment? You can, please.
I have said that, and I've mentioned it to Senator Borja also, that we are restricted. And even the questions you were just asking, how come we didn't do anything? How come you didn't know? Because we didn't have the power to go into the organization to look at these things. Honestly, there are restrictions on what we can and cannot do because of that provision in the law. Now, if you really want to do something different, you might want to look at the Department of Education at the same way you look at higher education. Give it that autonomy, give it control over procurement, which is one of the biggest issues that we have in the Guam Department of Education. It slows everything down. Give it a board that has power to ensure compliance. Give the board members a longer term. I suggested 6 years, so that they can act and not feel that they are limited in their authority. The PUC model works so well. The CCU model works well. This model doesn't work well, and I think part of the problem, and with due respect to the senators, and I've been among you in the past, the senators still want to control a lot of DOE. Maybe it's because of not being comfortable with the way it operated in the past or the finances or whatever, but we got to get beyond that. You have to empower the board. You have to give them the autonomy it needs.
Okay, with that said,
You have to give them trust also. You have to trust the board to do the right thing
so,
if you empower them.
okay, so speaking with the empowerment, so Dr. McNitch, did you want to chime in?
I'd also like to chime in after, if possible.
No, let me just stick with this first, please.
Thank you, Senator Gumatauta. I agree. Micromanagement is a vexing term. Part of it is it's undefined. You know, what does that mean, micromanagement? The other consideration I have that I'm a little bit afraid of is, rather than use micromanagement, use a more appropriate term. But I have to say, as a board member, I would always want to channel management-related things with the superintendent directly. My fear would be an individual board member going off on forays of, you know, can you imagine if there's issues with others that are making complaints? I think if board members are going to get involved more directly, they can't do it alone. They've got to do it where somebody else is with them to temper their behavior, so to speak.
Okay,
to keep
so with that said, during a November 4th, 2025 public hearing on a different but related bill, which proposes to extend the terms of both the elected and appointed board members, I referenced the committee's findings and recommendations for the measure that led to Public Law 30-183, which established the current Guam Education Board. Now, the Education Committee of the 30th Guam Legislature wrote that it intended to provide for a policy decision based on the proven success and accountability of the respective educational boards of the University of Guam and the Guam Community College. At that time, I remember that very vividly. I was serving as the Deputy Chief of Staff to former Guam Governor Felix Camacho. Dr. Guthridge, you were as a member of that 30th Guam Legislature, and the lady next to you was serving as the Speaker of the 30th Guam Legislature. So I wanted to ask, based on that, this bill gives the governor 4 appointments and the Speaker 2, with all but 6 serving at the pleasure of their appointing authority and removable without cause. To the panel, how does this structure insulate education policy from political interference, as Ms. Bukikosa mentioned earlier, especially when the governor and the Speaker may have competing interests? So let me go to this side. Maybe.
So as I mentioned earlier, in first reading the proposal, oh my God, appointed by Guadalupe and here. And again, it's nothing against the governor, whoever's serving, nothing against senators, whoever are holding the positions. But that just puts politics right back into the department and how it's run. Whether it becomes now, again, an appointed superintendent, you know, again, as I mentioned back in November in the town hall meeting, you know, been there, done that. We've had directors, and I'll call them directors at the time, that really had no experience in the education field. And again, I say that too about the members of the board. I'm willing to support it because it gives some guidance as to where these individuals should come from or what they represent. And I respect the others' opinions on, you know, we're kind of narrowing down. But the issue becomes, and I said it before, any Tom, Dick, and Harry who wants to run for the board, who has no experience whatsoever on education, on financing and how the budget works, on the processes within the department, Dr. Guthridge said it, procurement is an issue. Not the people in procurement, the process of procurement. How can the board then make some proposal, bring it here, and ask for change so the department can work more efficiently? That's what I'd like to see with the board. I want to see policy changes. I want to see recommendations for laws to change so we can improve. I look to them for, hey, help us. And I say us, even though I've been retired for 2 years. I see that my colleagues continue to suffer because no real changes are coming forward. Great resolutions, but what does that really do for changing law? We need to buddy with you. Hey, if it means, okay, the speakers, you know, representative's going to be in there, does that mean we're going to get more ear here? More support here in the legislature? I don't know. It's you got to balance, but we need more help with the department. And I don't just say that for DOE. That really is everywhere. But DOE specifically, because that's what we're here for.
Thank you so much. Jordan, you want to say something?
Yeah, so of course, directly to your question, I don't believe the bill as it's written right now does provide that protection from the politics of it all. That's why I think, you know, it was sort of recommended amongst the three of us is let's not necessarily do it as at the pleasure of, you know, let's, you know, the same thing with the superintendent, like I said, let's have the appointing authority appoint and let some other mechanism be the removing. Because, you know, like we said, it just subjects everything to politics. It's the same reason why I disagree with the idea of putting GDOE back under direct control of the governor. And it's the same reason why, you know, for me, my ideal version of a GDOE is that the buck stops with the superintendent. I don't necessarily agree that the buck stops with the governor because the governor's transfer authority doesn't necessarily apply to the funds of GDOE in the same way that it would in the other way. So the governor has the ability to transfer money into it, but not necessarily out of it. So there's no way for her to necessarily control it fully. She has a responsibility to, you know, potentially address with additional monies, but there's no guarantee there's additional money. And so I don't fault the governor for not putting up big bucks, you know, when GDO is in need. You know, and plus the audit shows there's plenty of money within the department right now. But of course, there's all these caveats that, you know, you went over in the oversight this morning about why it's all.
No, and I totally get it. I've been a signator on the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund as the Deputy Chief of Staff, so I get it. I understand where the administration would be coming from relative to having to have some accountability because they're the ones having to sign off on some of these grant programs. I just want to ask one last question because I know I'm running out of time, but I was going to kind of go at some of the bigger issues relative to some of the things I've heard publicly. But I just want to ask, we're trying to put policies forward that are helping to try to help improve the relationship between the board and GDOE management and staff in the interest of strengthening public education on Guam. Can that be done? I know we haven't heard from Mr. Chagaloff, but can that be done?
It could be done, and that's why I like the concept of an appointed board, and the appointed board should primarily focus on policies. And you know, we used to have two types, right? We have the executive-run school system. That's the governor's appointment. I like the idea that we have the governor to appoint and even the speaker to appoint too. And here's the reason why. They have a full managerial control, the operation, the funding here at the legislature, and then the governor has all the government resources that if there is a need to jump in to rescue the Guam Department of Education for whatever those merit reasons, issues are, the government resources are readily available under the governor's authority, and so as the Guam legislature. That's why I like the concept. The board really primary responsibility is to create policies, and that the operation should really be the management of both the legislature and the governor.
And with that said, removing elections means the public can no longer directly vote out underperforming board members. How does this bill ensure accountability to parents, students, and taxpayers in the absence of electoral accountability? And I think that's all I have in time. If anyone wants to address that.
I think, I have just a general comment in that I think that, again, it goes down to we need to implement some other form of removal, some other mechanism. Of course, like you said, you can't have just an appointment and then, oh, the governor likes their appointee. So of course they're not going to say, oh, I'm removing you from the board, even if they're not performing. So, if the appointments are, whether it's coming from the governor or the legislature, that's fine. But let the removal be through some form of mechanism where the public has direct input into, we want to recall this person. And, I think the reason why it sort of came up, because of course, Speaker Guthertz brought it up, Chair Guthertz brought it up, was that, really there are some recall, portions within government, or with Guam law, but the way that this is written, it doesn't reference those. So, whether that applies here or what the thresholds are for how many signatures, if it was a petition, right? It's not clear. So that's what my recommendation would be let the people be the determinants of whether or not we're going to recall something.
Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in on that? How do we ensure accountability? If we're not going to vote anymore, how do we do that? I mean, as a guy who had 3 kids in the public school system, I'm curious.
Yeah, under the current system, really the accountability, I mean, I was appointed by the governor to be a board member in 2015, I believe 2014, and I decided to step out, even though I was elected in 2016. And I find that as the current model of this board is that really we don't have that sense of accountability, that when the issues come before us, the operational matters really belongs to the superintendent, and that the superintendent acts independent really from the board. That many times there's conversation, and we were not really together as a board. I have to say that, and I have to admit that. We were not in sync in many of the issues. And that's why I like the idea, because when there are issues out there in the community, that we go directly to the appointing authority and say, we have shared our concern with the superintendent. There was no accountability there. We have shared it with the board, nothing. But now I am coming to you, the governor of Guam, and I was the associate superintendent when there are a lot of issues, and eventually the buck stops with the governor of Guam. And I appreciate that, because the accountability rests with the governor of Guam. Because at the board's level, if there are 9 of us, that superintendent has 9 supervisors. And each of the board members, really, this is true. We have our own personal agenda. And then we do, and let me just say this. I have the history of the elected school board. The elected school board occurred, it was enacted into law November 10, 1993. The election of the elected school board prior to 1994, because the election of the school board was on November 8, 1994. Prior to that time, it was an appointed board. I don't remember salient issues prior to 1994. After the elected school board, they assumed office January of 1995. On November 13, 1995, the issues that we are faced with right now are repeated issues since November 13, 1993. And let me just list what are some of the issues. About 300 employees, including parents and students, teachers and community members. We call it the March to Adelope. I participated in that march. The grievances include micromanaging, and abuse of power by the board. This is the elected board now. Harassment, fear, and intimidation. Personal transfers for punitive reasons. I was a recipient of that. Interference with the school operations. Lowering professional certification standards for teachers. And holding secret meetings. We have existed, the elected school board has existed for 32 years. And let me say this, that yes, you're right. Public Law 22-042 was enacted on November 10, 1993. Public Law 24-142 was enacted February 27, 1998 to replace the prior governance structure with a new model. Then Public Law 26-026, July 5, 2001, created a different administrative framework and redefined the roles of the superintendent and the governing board. Public Law 30-050, July 14, 2009, restored the agency's name of the public school system back to the Guam Department of Education. While primarily naming change, it affected the statutory governance. Then Public Law 30-183 established the current Guam Education Board, vested in the governance authority of the board, and redefined the board composition, duties, governance, and responsibilities. So really, we went from Territorial Board of Education to Board of Education to Guam Policy Board to now Guam Education Board. So we went through a lot of reforms throughout the life of the department, and I believe the Guam Department of Education was under the Territorial Board of Education in 1950s, and then 1994 is when we have now the elected school board. So looking at the two models, I say to myself, I couldn't remember when it's an executive-run school system, major issues coming out from the department. After that, in 1995, to this day, the same issue, I have it, it's the same issues that we are faced today. Something has to change. And I like the proposed bill because it gives really, again, my only thing here is that the board should be a policy board and let, whether it's legislative or governor or combined, be really an executive-run school system or legislative executive-run school system.
So the only thing different than in 2026 is that back in at that time there was 35,000 public school students. Today we're at 23,000.
That's correct.
But issues still remain. But fascinating discussion this afternoon, and I want to thank you all for being here. And Mr. Chair, that's all my questions. And thank you for the time.
Thanks, Senator Gumatata. Senator Barnett.
Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to everyone watching on our YouTube stream, and most especially thank you to the panel. Senator Gumatata is right. It's been a pretty fascinating discussion. A lot of history here in this discussion of Bill 286-38. Now, in the bill's legislative findings and intent, it reads that y legislatura en Guam finds that effective educational governance requires direct and balanced representation from those most impacted by education policy, including classroom educators, parents actively engaged in their children's education, representatives of business and industry who understand workforce development needs, et cetera, et cetera. The problem I have with the bill is that although it says that it finds effective educational governance requires direct and balanced representation from those most impacted by education, the bill removes the ability of those most impacted by education to act on things like voting out board members. And this is something that's kind of been glossed over in some of the testimony. And for me, that's the biggest thing in talking to other parents, stakeholders, is that this bill is pretty dressed up, but at its core, what it does is eliminate the people's right to vote for their Board of Education representatives. And that's kind of a big deal to me when you take away the people's ability to vote in any instance. And, you know, as we sit here and we're asking each other, how are we going to make sure it's accountable? How's it going to be transparent? I think we all kind of agree that I don't think it will be transparent. I don't think taking away the people's right to vote and giving it over to the politicians to run the Guam Department of Education, it just doesn't seem like the right move to me. And I've attended just about every town hall, those that I didn't make it to, I was sure to watch. And I never heard a single testimony from a single person say, you know, the Board of Education is not working, take away our ability to vote for who represents us. Nobody said that. In fact, I think the discussion was largely on whether we want to make the board a governing board or, you know, fine-tune whatever model that we want to do. Mrs. Bukakosa, I attended the hearing at the DOE Central Office. I was really surprised to see that you support the bill. But in your testimony, you said that initially your gut told you that there could be problems with it, and I agree with that initial assessment. You know, to give over the Guam Education Board to politicians, I mean, we might as well just give it back to the governor. Because then these political appointees will control who is selected as superintendent. They'll control everything instead of the people of Guam being able to really hold accountable those members who serve on the board. Now, that does not by any means mean that I support status quo. I think, you know, one of the first things that the legislature should do is really provide more consistent oversight. It's been my experience as the former chair that, you know, if you don't get GDOE in here, you know, monthly, I mean, you let them go for 6 months, things are just going to go all haywire. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing in this term is, you know, we don't hear from the Guam Department of Education. Things happen fast, they pile up, and then we as senators are left here trying to untangle all of the shenanigans, for lack of a better term. And so that's my problem with the bill, although I did really enjoy the discussion here, and I think, you know, Dr. Guthertz, you brought up a good point, how far we went to get to where we're at today. We lobbied the Congress of the United States of America to change our Organic Act to give our people the ability to vote for their Board of Education members. And I'm just not sure the conditions of the department, as complicated as they are, I don't think that warrants that we need to go backwards and give politicians even more power over our public school system. And I think, you know, as we sit here and we contemplate the bill and we try and we're jumping through a lot of hoops trying to figure out how do we get rid of these political appointees, I think, you know, that's a big sign that the bill is very problematic, and I would agree with the superintendent that it should be withdrawn. And I think we've had such a great discussion here. It'd be really good to have a roundtable where we invite more stakeholders, because I don't think we should make this big of a change without significant public input, especially if the public input we've already received did not ask for this. I didn't hear a single testimony from a single person saying, take away my ability to vote for the people who are going to represent my children in the public school system. And I am a public school parent. So those are just kind of my concerns. I don't really have any questions. I really enjoyed the testimony and the perspective. And again, I thank the chair for the opportunity to comment on the bill. Sidos Masi.
May I make a comment? You know, I really like the idea also that is being proposed by Dr. McNinch, you know, looking at each of the individual public schools to have their own site-based management or site-based board. And we still have the state board, Guam Board of Education, to focus on curriculum issues. And then the state board, I mean the school site, site-based management board would take care of the operations, working closely with the respective school principal. That's another model that probably something for us to ponder
I like that. Thank you, Mr. Chargala, for that input. I don't know if I necessarily agree with, 19 different boards across the schools, but I do agree with the site-based management, and this is something that senators had previously tried to implement at the Guam Department of Education, but at the time, if I remember correctly, it was opposed by the then superintendent.
Well, currently we have we have the Guam charter schools, right? I mean, we have the charter schools. How many charter schools? 7. And each of the charter schools have their own board of trustees. And yet then we have the charter school council, the Guam Academy Charter School Council, and they're responsible for, they are really the approving authority. But the individual schools govern themselves, of course, with the board of trustees working closely with the CEO. Yeah, that's another model that we may want to do.
For that, Mr. Chargaloff. It's just been my experience too, and that kind of model where I've as a former chair had discussions with the Guam Academy Charter School Council Chair Vanji, and she had said that. We need to amend the law to hold the Board of Trustees accountable, because although the Board of Trustees run the individual charter schools, they're not beholden to the chair. And so that's kind of a little loophole that I think, we can hopefully work together to address. Dr. McNinch, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Senators. I just wanted to mention very briefly, when I first joined the board in 2016, I did a full assessment, and I came up with a number of suggestions, and the board members accepted them. One of them, for example, was to meet at the same place with announced times well in advance. And also, the bigger thing was to live stream everything on Facebook. And I know that Senator Borja mentioned that there's interactions with board members at these board sessions. I think there's probably then a record of it. I think there's probably video of it. And I have to say that I've been thinking about this since you mentioned that. I think if a board member's interacting with employees, either the employee or the board member should record it. It's almost like having police having the body cam, and then it will maybe mitigate some of these things. I don't know. I've never myself encountered really strong negatives myself and with others, but I mean, I can't understand that point. But I think there's some value to live stream video, and also the record that the live stream video provides, at least for board oversight purposes. Thank you.
Thank you. If the chair just allow me to finish, and I agree, Dr. McNinch, and I think that's why a lot of us were scratching our head when board members are saying that they've never heard of harassment from board members to employees, because we see it on the live stream during these board meetings. Just one last point on the political appointees, because it was brought up that people are appointed. It's rare, but it does exist. Of course, the Chamorro Land Trust Commission was mentioned, and I just want to make a point that these political appointees were only removed when they stopped doing the bidding of the people who appointed them. And that is, as soon as we have these politically appointed school board members on that board, and they stop listening to the governor or the senators, and they start acting in the best interest of our students and our public schools, you just watch, they're going to get fired because they're not following the political agenda. And that's what I think the most dangerous thing about this bill is. Mr. Chair.
May I please also make a comment? Dr. Menenche, you talked about live stream and board meetings. I do want to bring up that in committee meetings, which are also, I believe, put live stream on social media, at least I've been told.
Committee meetings aren't necessarily.
I'm sorry?
Not all committee meetings are live streamed.
So I do want to point out that repeatedly in certain committees, employees have been named and have been ridiculed, demeaned, myself included. I was named in a meeting when I was taking my terminal leave, and I was named that I was doing something illegal. And I brought this up to the management team. I spoke to the superintendent personally, and I said, after 34 years of working for this department, I cried, honestly. I felt that my integrity was being questioned, my ethics. I'm sorry, I have bent over backwards. I have worked tremendously long hours, and to be told I was doing something illegal and named. Every week, an employee in some middle management position was being belittled, We were repeatedly told, oh, you people sitting in your central office tower, you're incompetent, you don't know what you're doing, you're not doing anything. I'm sorry, those comments have been made repeatedly in the media, whether it be on social media, during meetings, committee meetings, in print media, and by board members, and I say not just one, I've heard it on a couple. If it's brought up to the board, I kind of felt it was just being swept under the rug and nothing was getting done. But I do have to commend, during certain meetings, when someone made some inappropriate comment, I would hear someone say, that is an operational issue and that is not our purview. I applaud those who have made those comments, but repeatedly, and this is like a norm, and that's why I continue to say those specific board members that make it a constant, this is their position, this is their attitude, and it's my responsibility as a board member to do this. No, it's not. We look to the board to be policy making. Interfering in operations and belittling employees from support staff to administrators is inappropriate. And those kind of actions should be addressed. And again, I really look to the board as I want individuals with some experience and expertise. And that's why I like that part of it.
Dispensa, on that part I agree, and that's why I'm not sure if we need to change the whole model. Maybe we need to make the qualifications, a little more stringent. Dispensa, Mr. Chair. Sidos Masi.
Go ahead, Dr. McNinch.
Thank you, Senators. Madam, what is your name?
Doris Bukikosa. I retired from the Department of Education.
Thank you, Ms. Doris. I have to say, as a board member, I apologize you're treated that way.
Thank you. I want to respond to Senator Barnett's comment. He's right. Nobody has publicly come and say, I want to get rid of the elected school board. He's absolutely right, and that's the problem. We all know this. Most of us do, at least, is that nobody will ever come, at least. And even when this bill was put together, I shared, and Mr. Chargaloff, we've had conversations on. I'm responding to the ask, but we need people to speak up. Thank you, Ms. Bokugosa. Jordan, I think you're going to be okay.
I don't think. I don't think I said anything that was contemptuous or anything.
But
so
what I want to say to those listening is that we hear you. And again, I'm not. It's going to take 7 other senators to. But I want to continue to encourage the employees. I mean, really, Dr. Wampat, you've committed, Dr. Guthridge, you guys have committed to listen, Dr. McNinch, to listen to these employees. They need to be heard, because believe me, I mean, we will respond as senators. That's our duty as elected officials. But I prefer that you guys handle these issues at the department level, because again, you guys can come in here and tell us everything we want to hear in regards to the issue, but we ultimately hope that the board or Dr. Wampat and your leadership team can really address because just like we don't work for, we work for them, they don't work for us. I believe that's the same thing for the board, Dr. Wampat and your leadership team. You guys work for the employees of the Department of Education. And I know sometimes we could ask 1,000 questions, but, I tell anybody you ask for something, we'll at least get a response. That's the obligation that we have to the constituent. And that's why we're here today. If we're up to, like Senator Barnett said, he would like for you guys to come in every month. That's just not the way I work, right? Because I feel like we could get more done outside of the public hearing room, rather than, because this is a lot of work, and I'm not saying I'm not willing to do the work. But again, the ask, I think, from the Department of Education, its employees, its stakeholders, is they just want to be heard, and they're looking for change. And, this bill is not perfect. No bill is perfect. We'll continue to collect testimony. Thank you, everybody, for your testimonies today. If there are any further testimony or questions for the panel, or if there are no more questions for the panel, we'll conclude this hearing, but we'll also continue to collect testimony from those who are willing to submit testimony you can drop it off here to the Guam Legislature or DNA Building Suite 502, Agatna, Guam 96910. This concludes today's public hearing for Bill number 286-38. We are now adjourning at 5:14 p.m. Thank you, everybody.